Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. And I want to welcome you to the second episode of the fourth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America and really around the world. The last episode was a timely and important discussion on religion and the public intellectual. I want to thank Monique Moultrie, Andrew Whitehead, and Mira Sukharov, who were just excellent panelists and brought so much to the ideas and the concepts of the public intellectual and the work that we need to do both inside and outside of the academy. If you didn't get a chance to check it, please look at it on our YouTube channel or through our Facebook page, and you can find out additional materials about this episode through the episode notes and teaching resources that are attached to this episode. We have syllabi and materials and questions that the panelists have provided, and we're really excited that you will have a chance to kind of dig deeper with your students and your community as you think about this topic and the rest of the topics that we will explore throughout the year. Today, we are turning to religion and AI, or religion and artificial intelligence. I almost think that there need to be no introduction to this episode other than that the ubiquity of Chat GPT and conversations and commentaries and ideas and critiques of AI, the way that it's going to change our field and our lives and our orientation. And so we want to think about, with these amazing panelists that we've gathered, is that AI is not simply a large language model or an idea model that disrupts our work, but that it substantively changes our field, our practice as teachers, and our engagement in religious settings. And so we are excited to bring together folks from a wide variety of disciplines today, from theology and from departments of computer science and from religious studies, to think about the way in which artificial intelligence in all of its formations is changing the way that we do our way, the way that we think, and the way that we engage. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit their questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our hosts and panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this important conversation. Now, let me introduce the host for today's conversation. Today, we have Dr. Robert Saylor, who is an associate professor of Christianity and culture at Christian Theological Seminary. He is one of my favorite polymaths, moving from Radiohead to sabbatical pastoral practices to orthodoxy and conspiracy theorists without even taking a breath. He is going to be an amazing conversationalist this afternoon, and he's just a joy to be in a conversation with and to work with. And I thank him for helping to pull together this episode. His forthcoming book, which is again just speak to his breadth and his depth, is The Last True Rebellion: Death to the World and the Theological Aesthetics of Anti-Modernism. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Robert Saylor, as he will introduce the rest of today's panel.
Hello, friends. Well, as Joseph said, my name is Rob Saylor, and I teach religion and culture at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And I'm also pleased to be a fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI, who's hosting this conversation. We're here discussing religion and AI. I might venture to say that maybe even as recently as 8 months ago, this topic might have seemed speculative and perhaps even somewhat abstract, a sort of science fiction excursion as a hiatus from more pressing and immediate issues. If that ever was the case, then it is certainly the case no more. Be it OpenAI and its attendant platforms such as Chat GPT, or conversations around the intellectual workforce and the impact of emerging AI in sectors previously thought less vulnerable to replacement by technology, or academic questions about AI's future among student work and scholarly research, suddenly this topic is quite timely. And as is the custom with this Religion and series, we'd like to think together this afternoon about how the methods and questions characteristic of religious studies might helpfully join this broader societal conversation. I'll be putting some of these questions to our panel, but at this point, we can signal some main lines of inquiry. To what extent are metaphors and images taken from religious studies helpful in illuminating what is at stake in the growing presence of AI? Conversely, where might they occlude more than they illuminate? Does the religious studies classroom provide a particular sort of case study in how AI might helpfully be present in the student's experience and in scholarly experience? And how does terminology such as the soul, the human spirit, or the spiritual factor into precise analysis of AI and its possible human futures? Before I introduce our panelists, I want to reiterate that if you're watching this in real time, so to speak, and you'd like to pose a question to the panel, we certainly welcome you doing so in the Q&A feature. We'll try to devote a portion of the program towards the end to questions that you might have. It's a real pleasure to host this conversation, and it's an even deeper pleasure to be joined by three scholars whose work I regard highly and whom I'm privileged to count as friends. I'll introduce them just briefly. John Ivan Gill is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Gustavus Adolphus College and Cross-Community Coordinator at the Center for Process Studies. He's written on Afrofuturism, religion, hip-hop, philosophy, post-structuralism, atheism, and creative writing. He's co-owner also of Serious Cartoons, Records, and Tapes in San Bernardino, California, and also Tijuana, Mexico. And he also has a career as a solo hip-hop artist using the moniker Gilead 7. His first book, Underground Rap as Religion, a theopoetic examination of process aesthetic religion, is in the Routledge Studies in Hip-Hop and Religion series. His latest self-edited student volume, Towards Afro-Diasporic and Afrofuturist Philosophies of Religion, was released in April of 2022. Catherine G. Schmidt is Associate Professor at Molloy University in New York. She teaches a variety of courses in religious studies and ethics at the university. Her research focuses on the relationship of theology and culture, specifically digital culture and technology. She's the author of numerous chapters on the subject, as well as the monograph Virtual Communion, Theology of the Internet and the Catholic Sacramental Imagination, which was published in 2022 by Lexington Academic. And then finally, Crystal Clavel holds a PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago's Divinity School, and also completed fellowship training in clinical medical ethics at the McLean Center, where she continues as a senior fellow. She has served as acting director of the Zygon Center for Religion and Science in Chicago, and was a fellow in the Sinai and Synapses program. She has a clinical background as a chaplain and ethicist at the University of Chicago Medical Center, and currently she teaches ethics in the computer science department at University of Illinois at Chicago, where she also serves on the hospital ethics committee and the medical school ethics education committee. Her research interests encompass the ethics of emerging biotechnologies, organ transplant ethics, the role of religion in medical education, AI and religion, and the function of ethics committees in hospitals and tech companies. It is so good to convene this panel, and I look forward to learning from these folks along with everyone else. Let me start with some historical location. It seems to me that whenever we talk about religion and technology, we immediately face two extremes. One might be described as sort of a there's nothing new under the sun mindset, where the admittedly true point that humans have always faced technological change becomes a rationale for dismissing the importance of new technology. And the other extreme might be a sort of over exuberance about the newness of a given paradigm. This is an utter seismic shift. Every generation thinks it's the end of the world, as we say. If, as I suspect, the answer is somewhere in between, or maybe some third option, then, friends, how would we describe where we are historically with these new technologies? What is genuinely novel and what has precedence? Catherine, I wonder if we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Joseph. It occurred to me this week as I was thinking about these things that there are a lot of people in almost every walk of life who want to talk about these things. And so I'm just kind of filled with gratitude today to kind of have some space to talk about this. But I'm also pretty nervous because I have to go first. So, Rob, it's funny, I was teaching Ecclesiastes yesterday, so I am sort of like, I kind of do want to just throw my hands up and say there's nothing new under the sun, which tells you a little something about my first thought on a lot of these things, which is to think about continuity, right? So what is continuous about the stuff that we're dealing with now? Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is that I think since we started playing with computers, we've always kind of wondered what more they can do. So there is something, I think, continuous there with how we generally approach this technology. The other thing that comes to mind is just maybe a little bit more 21st century, which is our use of data sets, right? So we've long used data sets, or sort of, trying to figure out how we can better collect data and use data is not really that new. And then also just sort of our interaction with machines, which we might think that, or with computers specifically, we might think that this is pretty new, but my students who are 21, 22, they were asking me the other day how I got around without GPS. And so before it happened, right? So they, at least for the last couple of decades, this is something that we are used to, which is putting data into a machine and getting data back out of it in this kind of more human-like way, right? Through a voice and things like that. The other thing that comes to mind is that we're not kind of, like you said, technological paradigm shifts are not new for religious traditions, I think. What strikes me as being pretty new and maybe a little unsettling is that we've moved beyond those sort of data set AI technologies like Alexa or like the basic GPS or something, and towards this generative one. And so as a theologian, I'm thinking about just even you mentioned metaphors from religion. I'm thinking about linguistic metaphors of generation and creation. And I was reading yesterday about the phenomenon of hallucination, which is something that Chat GPT does. So just the ways in which we are using just simple linguistic metaphors, it strikes me as, on the one hand, this is what we have to do, is to find these metaphors. On the other, we really are ascribing a lot more anthropological, I think, personality traits to machines in a way that we haven't in the past.
I want to hear from the others, but just really quickly, Catherine, AI hallucinating. Can you what's going on there? I haven't heard of that.
Crystal might be able to correct me on this, but as far as I understand it, when AI stumbles upon, so it's pattern recognition and then pattern sort of generation, right? And when they kind of hit right, when it hits a block, it sort of guesses, right? And then this is, I think, what's going on when you see like the images that you get through AI and like the hands look weird. I think that's something like a hallucination. I don't know. I just learned about this yesterday. So this is another thing, right? The speed at which we have to keep on top of these things. So Crystal might be able to jump in. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think everything you said was so interesting, Catherine. The hallucinations, it's when the predictive text, I'm thinking more about text than pictures, but when the predictive text gives you something that's untrue, which, it's interesting to think of something that's not true as being a hallucination, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Maybe truth is a little bit different. Or if it gives you citations, sort of academic style citations that don't exist, right? It sort of created something whole cloth that should be there to ground what has been put into the text, but it doesn't actually exist. So one thing you can do is sort of try to get Chat GPT to give you your own bio back, right? And it definitely doesn't get me right. It's not pulling from an actual bio of me off of the internet. It's sort of, well, there's something about Crystal Clavel out there, and the we of the AI, the they, as you said, will predict what else should be associated with my name based on what it does find. So there are lots of hallucinations there. In terms of like precedents, I think the escapism of wanting to flee our bodies, I think that's a precedent, and an interest in omnipotence. could we find something omnipotent? Could we project omnipotence onto something and then use it for a kind of certainty? And then the pattern recognition, like I think about like psychoanalysis, which is in many ways a lot of pattern recognition that is deeply beneficial to patients, and an interesting theory. And this is really what a lot of AI is doing, not as a psychoanalyst, but it has value.
Fascinating. John, any thoughts on this question of precedent and continuity?
Yeah. I think in the moment that we're in now, it really does bring us to, I think this third space is a great way to talk about where we are. Because I was trying to say this even in class yesterday, and when we were talking, because we're in this thing, and we could say this has always been the case, and this is simply a new way of talking about something old, to kind of conjure how Jay talked about pragmatism. But I think there is something different that is happening, if that difference is because we're overwhelmed by this newness of this curve. Because we could say the same thing about the car. When automobiles came into existence, well, we asked those similar questions. Well, we, not me, but I mean, and maybe not anyone in this room, but people had similar questions. And now we're living with cars, and the questions that we ask now are, how do we make them more efficient? How do we make them how do we make them coincide with the environment in beneficial ways? At least some of us ask those questions. Some people don't really care. Some corporations don't really care. But I think there's something that's really happening with this. Is kind of overwhelming, and I utilize Black Mirror to teach my classes. Anytime I teach, intro to philosophy, I'm teaching ancient philosophy right now. We're doing our class, Rob and I, on technology and the soul with Black Mirror. But I think the shock value of this is something that Black Mirror helps us to grapple with, because in that world, it's not shocking. These technologies where people can see the past by just pressing a button, and are able to have lives in computers. It's commonplace, and that, I think, is the draw. And so I think we're in this period of gestation that's kind of causing us to kind of rethink, and that is I think, if anything is going on, not that it's just that, but I think that this is the main part of it.
That's great. I was just thinking about this. I mean, this is all anecdotal, but it occurs to me that, I've been thinking about questions of technology for a long time. And when I'm sort of out in the world talking to non-academics, they're like, oh, that's interesting. What I'm realizing now is like how willing now people are to ask the existential questions, like from every discipline. So John, I think you're dead on, like that it maybe the focusing on sort of what's new about the technology is not as interesting a question as what's new about the ways in which, for some reason, we collectively, culturally, are responding to it in a more sort of existential way. And why is that happening, right? What's going on? And it's probably more complex than just the technology. There's probably several cultural factors, right? So someone said it's not the end of the world. Well, scientifically, it kind of is, like climate change wise, it kind of is. So maybe that's part of it too, So thanks for that.
Yeah, I've for the last year or so, I've been wrestling with Hartman-Rosa's theories of acceleration, and unlike Rosa, I don't necessarily see that as a grand unifying theory for everything, but I have found that language helpful to describe some of this. It's like, it's not so much the novelty of the technology itself, it's the speed at which these changes happen, and then the sort of attendant speeds of change across social registers, economic registers, that sort of thing. And at a certain point, quantitative change in terms of increasing speed becomes qualitative transformation. And maybe something like that is, accounts for some of that existential aspect that you all are pointing to. Well, let's dive into the language question too. And in some ways, this is just I think the simplest way to put this question is, what does religious studies proper bring to this, society-wide debate that we're having? But let me frame it specifically in terms of language. It seems to me that talk of AI and then various kinds of attendant discourses, around singularity, that sort of thing, they've often functioned as invitations to employ language that religious studies scholars are familiar with. Talk of, for instance, of the soul or of human distinctiveness, or even at a more technical level, the interplay between mechanical technologies and modes of governance. So to what extent is it that religious or religion adjacent language is helpful in illuminating what's at stake here? And on the flip side, when can the language that's most familiar to us religion scholars, or practitioners for that matter, when does that run the risk of obfuscating more than illuminating? John, let me start with you and then see others weigh in.
Yeah, and that's such a good framing of it, Rob. And it's something I think about a whole lot. It's especially as a process humanist who got there through theology, and is very concerned and was always, I don't even know if concerned is the word, but very interested in the possibilities of religious language outside of the domain that sometimes we commonly relegate them to. What is that? Whitehead has this notion of secularizing religion. So, what does it mean to secularize the idea of God? First of all, talking about God as simply an idea, or saying that, well, God only has to be an idea. Now, whatever else God is might follow, but all we really need from this is an idea. And how is distilling the idea something that is beneficial for the world? And I think that in many ways goes into how we talk about the possibilities of sentience in AI, the possibilities of awareness, the possibility, because we're talking about that which we have called the soul in a machine. But there's something valuable about it, I think, and this is the positive. This is the generating part of it. This is the positive part of it, I think, and positive in quotes, is that, well, this sort of language, it allows us to struggle with that which is the most beneficial in this experience that we're calling consciousness. That language, it causes a sort of enchantment, to even use David Ray Griffin's words, re-enchantment without supernatural, or even what Jerome Stone calls a minimalist vision of transcendence. Can I talk about transcendence and still be in the world? If so, how do I do it? And if so, is it beneficial? I would say it is. And this is a way for me, to be conscious of the creations, even to use what we read yesterday, the created co-creator idea that Phil Hefner brings up. How do we create and be mindful of this experience that we value so much and that is valuable? That I think is very important when we're looking at digital entities who have the same experience, who will one day possibly have the same experience as we do. How do I ethically interact with them? That's one thing. I think where things get obscure, but I like the obscurity of this, is when, because I always say this, and this is, I think, a thing about a characteristic of theology, the language games, Wittgenstein, that you can play, causes us to open up various worlds. For example, but it in some ways forces us into a space to where we have to have dialogue. Because when I say God, my mom hears something, but that's not what I said. But the fact that that terminology is utilized and there's something in common, it brings us into a place to where now we share a space of dialogue that we may not have before if said language wasn't used. So I do think that in this digital space, religious language in its classical sense gets obscured, which is good for its future.
Yeah, excellent. Catherine, I wonder if you have thoughts on this sort of language question.
I do. John's got me thinking about like 1,000 things, so I'm trying to get my thoughts together. But yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued by. I think you're right that there's something about the task of theology that we are used to playing with terms, and it seems to me sort of a feature of theology, but sort of religious traditions in general, that we are always aware that language is failing us, right? That it's not going to be a literal sort of explanation of what's going on. And what's concerning me right now, I think, and this is sort of something I wrote about, is like one of the times I first got to really write about this topic, is the ways in which people are not understanding the metaphors we're using for AI as metaphors, right? So learning, even intelligence itself, right? Those are metaphors, right? That technicians are giving to us as a way of best trying to describe to people like me what's going on. But we, I think, in sort of general public discourse, are taking them literally. So that's one thing that sort of is concerning to me. And on a sort of more positive note, what occurs to me is that this existential question, right, is that at the end of the day, I think theology really is about kind of what it means to be human, both sort of inherently, but then also teleologically. So where are we going? And that's kind of at the heart of all of this, right? So the ways in which we can apply the discourse around eschatology, for example, or the discourse around, I mean, something like ethics, right? We're sort of circled back to our discipline being kind of the whole point, which is kind of cool, right? That it becomes now like, okay, so what's the purpose of human activity if so many of these machines can actually just do human activity? And that's our wheelhouse, right? What's the purpose of being human? Where are we going? What's the purpose of all of this? So yeah, it's kind of interesting as I've been thinking about this so much this week, is like, man, I've been seeing this as sort of doom and gloom, but maybe it's actually a kind of renaissance for theological discourse. Maybe that's very optimistic.
It's a Thursday afternoon. We could be optimists for a few minutes here. Yeah, it's Crystal. I want to ask you about this in a second. Catherine, your point reminded me. Someone put in the chat, we were talking about a car earlier, and as a mode of sort of seismic shift in technology. And this commenter says, an example of a car would not be appropriate in the case of AI because cars were replacing the traditional mode of transport, which were animals, horses, cows, camels, elephants, etc. So our thinking, according to this comment, was not directly impacted by it. AI, according to the comment, is directly hitting humans and their thinking process at the core. And I think sort of echoes of some of the points that you and John are making. Crystal, any thoughts on this question of religious and religious adjacent language in this discourse?
I think so. I think I appreciate John and Catherine's comments for sure. I'm thinking about the metaphors, the metaphorical aspect of it, and the extent to which my students don't think they're using metaphors when they talk about learning, machine learning. Like they may give, I think they would say that they do anthropomorphize machines a little bit, but I think there's something very deep in some parts of STEM education in the United States anyway, that suggests that rational activity is in fact what defines the human being. And so that what the machines can do, if we can sort of transport our rationality into them, is that they could be fully human. And I think I try to push back on that with other kinds of conceptualizations about being human, which definitely comes from religious studies in my background and from chaplaincy work and pastoral care. When you're caring for a dementia patient, how are you interacting with them from the rational perspective? Like, would you say that they are just as fully human as people who potentially don't hallucinate? Go back to the hallucinations, right? And so I try to get my students to locate themselves in that kind of space. And I found religious studies to be really helpful in that, metaphorically and otherwise.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
sorry. Well, what it betrays is what we think learning, let's just take learning, for example, what we think it is anyway, right? So this is back to Freire, right? How we think about education. If we think about it as sort of the aggregation of data that's given to you by somebody else, then yeah, the machines are learning on that level. But I mean, that's what's so interesting. And we're going to talk about the classroom probably a little bit later, but it's opening up these discussions in a way is like, okay, well, you're assuming that learning is a certain kind of thing, or you're assuming intelligence is a certain kind of thing. Here are these, myriad traditions who have thought long and hard about what it means to actually be human. And they're not always just about the ability to process information in some sort of, mechanistic kind of way. And that's sort of dominated, I think, a lot of how we've thought over the past few hundred years, but it's not the only way. And so that's what I'm saying. We're sort of circling back to older traditions, right? For better or worse.
Yeah, this question of how to describe the excess. I mean, I was at a conference. Again, these things move so quickly. I feel like this anecdote that I'm about to say would not be remarkable now, but 4 months ago it was remarkable. I was at a conference and I was sitting with some friends from various disciplines, and somebody who teaches in a medical school mentioned that she has been engaging in Chat GPT therapy. Using Chat GPT as her therapist / life coach and so on. And, at that time around the table, we were all trying to get our bearings as to how we felt about this. And what struck me about that conversation in relation to what we're talking about right now is I think many of us at the table wanted to say, well, no, there's some kind of surplus, some kind of human element that's there if it's a real human therapist, that even a very sophisticated OpenAI platform is not going to be able to replicate. But being able to articulate exactly what that is, a trained licensed human therapist is drawing on training, a wealth of knowledge, sort of accessing, this data and hopefully applying it with wisdom, describing the difference between that and what a Chat GPT does. And also the lines of accountability, right? A licensed therapist has a community and licensure and ethics boards and so on that Chat GPT does not have. My point is, I'm just really struck by how all of us intuited that there was some kind of human factor that was not being taken into account, but all of us were struggling to name exactly what that might be. Crystal, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot. I think about therapy a lot, actually. And one of the thing that I think is important is that my therapist can suffer. Like, not only could she has more than likely, just because she's human. And I feel like that's part of what's missing, even with the really advanced pattern recognition and dialogical capacities of some OpenAI systems. But there's something human about that that's really helpful.
Yeah. Chris, I wonder if we could stay with you for a second. And again, as we mentioned in the introduction, you're in an interesting kind of teaching situation now, trained in the religious studies, the humanities, teaching now in a religious studies department, as well as your work with ethics, in various caregiving settings. I wonder if you could just reflect what that experience has taught you in terms, I guess I'm thinking especially of the same question of, how are those who are on the front lines of tech development and computer science talking about these things, and what do you notice about the resonance or not with how humanities scholars are doing it?
Yeah. So I mainly teach undergrads and then some graduate students, both in the medical school and then in like biomedical informatics programs. And at least with the computer science students, they seem a lot less enthusiastic about AI than the people who are very sort of slick and out there and trying to sell us the powers of AI. Like, I think they're excited, the students are excited about productivity, about maybe like, what would it be like to try to build this? Like there's an enthusiasm of like, can I use my mind to build this thing, which would be so exciting. And I can appreciate that as someone who enjoys the work I do as well. but a lot of them are interested in harnessing AI for good and trying to figure out, what they think the good is in any particular context and what they could do. So sort of the all-consuming aspect of technology and our lives getting more and more technological. The average computer science student now is also, pretty social justice oriented in my experience, which is exciting. Maybe they'll put up some of their own guardrails and not have to rely on everyone creating codes of ethics for them. The students are also really interested in history of ideas. I think that's part of what they like about the way I teach their ethics class. They like the idea that the things that they're interested in have a history. That there's the automata in German literature, and people have been thinking about that for a long time, and that now they can make robots, and that they're moving in that direction. That they're not so ecclesiastical about it, so Ecclesiastes oriented about there's nothing new under the sun, but they like the idea that there's a history to the things that they themselves value. Yeah, I'll stop there and let somebody else talk briefly. Anyway.
Well, I want to just ask about the classroom in general. All of us are classroom teachers, and I'm suspecting all of us, many people who are tuning in, are thinking about this question of AI in the classroom. Before I turn to that, let me just remind everyone, if you're joining us and you'd like to ask a question that I can pose to the panelists, feel free to pop that into the Q&A feature on the Zoom. But let's talk about this question of student use of AI, or conversely, your use of AI, if you do use it in teaching. It's something that obviously transcends the religious studies classroom, but is definitely present in the religious studies classroom as well as elsewhere. I won't necessarily ask you to name your I won't ask you to read your syllabus as to whatever the policy you put in there about AI use, although you can if you like. But let's see, John, do you want to weigh in? Just what do you say to students, and what do you say to yourself about AI in the classroom?
Yeah, I think kind of going off of what Crystal was just saying. Like I had, this I have students who are really interested in the history of ideas, and especially around what we can do in the future. And so in the classroom, that comes up in various ways. I'm pretty, well, in terms of, I guess, technology, not necessarily AI in particular here, but I'll talk about AI in just a minute. I am very open with people utilizing their devices for the purpose of what we're there for. Now, of course, they may do more than that. And that's not really, that's kind of on them. But yeah, I'm very, very open about what you can do with technology in the classroom. Now, AI in particular, I don't have a strict policy on how that comes up in my classrooms, but I do encourage its usage in my classes, and probably more so outside of them. Insofar as what's happening is not developing laziness. But how can, well, maybe running into an AI generated paper on XYZ, how might that encourage you to do your own research on something? And also, how might that let you know about this kind of gap you're talking about, Rob, between the therapist, the AI therapist, and what Crystal was saying, a therapist who can suffer, which is actually a really good point. How can what AI generates in terms of information show you about its deficiencies and about that which may, at this point, make the human experience something that has a different substance to it? Now, that may not always be the case, but now maybe at this point we can say, well, there. So I like to think about it in those ways.
I want to, before I turn to the others, I just want to make sure I understand something you're saying, John. I think when you say you encourage the use of AI, outside the classroom, say in writing student papers, am I hearing right that your theory there is that in the process of students seeing what AI generates on a topic, that might actually further their curiosity and make them more likely to follow up? Because I think that's I think some people might think that way. Some people might think, oh, it's the opposite. If AI generates the paper, then students aren't going to wrestle with it anymore.
And let me be clear. This is not. I'm not asserting that students turn that in. I'm not. No. This is not what I'm. No. I'm asserting that, kind of like in the sense of a Wikipedia article, this may generate further curiosity into something, so yeah. And now sometimes it may be the end all be all, but I think it is, I think I would assume that all of us as educators have had students who have ran into a rabbit hole because of something they ran into off of something like that.
Catherine or Crystal, where are you at in terms of how you work with students on this?
So I teach mostly undergrads, mostly first year students. And so I don't have a lot of majors. I'm teaching students from all different disciplines who are generally not very interested in religion or theology. And I've always seen my vocation as, and truly a vocation, of trying to put forward a model of education that is not purely utilitarian. And there is some way in which this sort of the use of Chat GPT in education is just a logical conclusion of how we've been talking to students about what college is for in general, right? So we've been framing it in capitalist terms for the last however many years. And then we're surprised when they're trying to find the most efficient way to get through our classes, to get the degree, to get the job. So, I of course I get frustrated with them on individual bases when they use it, and turn it in for their own work. But in some ways they can't really be blamed because they've been being told that education is this particular kind of thing since they were maybe even 9th graders or 10th graders, right? Your example, if I could just for a second, your example of the therapist is helpful, but I'll give you one that's a little bit more challenging, which is I was talking to somebody yesterday who's an accountant, and he was saying, this could replace my job. Now, a therapist, I like what you said, Crystal, about the suffering, but do I need a human accountant? Do I need like a human being to do that kind of work? And I think for a lot of people, again, because their jobs are primarily framed in meaning around the market, right? And not around any sort of human kind of connection, that is going to throw them, I think, into an existential crisis if they do start getting replaced by AI, which is the big fear, right? So I think that there's something about opening up a discussion for us, and we can do this at schools like mine, which are sort of these small liberal arts Catholic schools, about what we're doing here. What's the point of this? What do we actually think we're doing when we're learning? Because if we're just gathering information to check boxes, then AI is, like I said, sort of the logical conclusion of that. But I'm pretty strict. I mean, there's no world in which my students need to be using AI. And in terms of ethics, I mean, Crystal could probably speak to this. Like anytime I've tried to have a conversation about ethics with my Snapchat AI, it's purely utilitarianism. It's pure relativism. It's like there's no space for ethical theories, I don't think, that are a little bit more robust at this point anyway. So
sitting here trying to decide if I've ever caused my accountant to suffer. I think just because of my bad record keepings, not not sure if that's empathy per se. Crystal, how have you thought about this?
My parents are accountants, and I think I have caused them suffering, but not as my accountant. How am I thinking about it? I try to have conversations, like I try to have my class be a space where we can have a conversation about what education is for. I try to do that, and I think it's somewhat refreshing sometimes to the students because they have probably had encountered other classes that do this, but by the time they're in my class, they've had a whole lot of technical coursework that doesn't have the space for that. And yeah, you can get a lot of interesting responses from them about what they want and what their educations have been like so far. I don't want them to use Chat GPT, but being in a computer science department that has embraced it as a tool, right? So the new program developers, the new people who do a lot of coding and AI, they're going to be using it as a tool in the workforce. Mm-hmm. And what the workforce wants is retrojected back into what the curriculum is, right? In a lot of fields. And I'm always trying to work against that. So that sort of puts me at a disadvantage to just say, no, you can't use it at all. I think the policy is something like, if you need a draft, you need to sort of get a draft out there, you'd have to revise it significantly. And if I can tell that you use Chat GPT, that this is a problem. Because now that this tool exists for pros, you have to be better than the tool, which means writing is now harder for you than it was before this existed. Because you have to sort of show that you have a value beyond this tool, or people are just going to use the tool. I think ideally, and what I'd like to move toward, because of what Catherine said about the ethics, the relativism that's built in to ChatGPT's ethics answers, is to have them use ChatGPT to answer a question and then respond to it. Because a lot of the students are also moral relativist. Like they see that as the default position for inclusivity, right? And so in some ways, ChatGPT in its current iteration is mirroring back to them what they already think. And so if we could harness that pedagogically, I think that could be beneficial. Who knows, the next version of ChatGPT may be better in some sense, and then we'll have to revise again. But
one practical consideration, which actually I think is maybe it's also intellectual, is that ChatGPT uses whatever you put into it to make itself better. And that means that students are putting my questions that I have written, my assignments, into ChatGPT, which is an interesting thing right now, because anything created by AI, at least created by AI, is not copyright, but they're putting my intellectual property into the data set. And so there's, I think on some level, I've never really thought about my assignments as I've written them as intellectual property, but they're curriculum development. They're things that, I mean, yeah. So there's just that strikes me as I am against my consent. My words are going into ChatGPT, and the students don't see it that way, but it is what's happening, right? I'm giving my intellectual property to OpenAI, which is funded by Microsoft. So they now have my assignments, right?
Yeah, we've seen similar things even with anti-plagiarism software, right? Which is built into my school's LMS. I almost don't have a choice whether to use it or not, but similar kinds of things. That's how it builds that data set, is incorporating all of these new papers in this case from students' work. We have a question in the chat, a couple of comments from the chat. One, I think picking up on the connection between this and sort of evolution more broadly. And I think, as we all have indicated, not only does this touch on economic questions, but it also touches on other kinds of topics such as like transhumanism, right? And those kinds of discourses, which is another area where even the choice of how to describe it, even the choice of what language to use, begins to betray certain kinds of commitments or standpoints on it. But I know this is an interest that several of you have. We have a question here. I'll just read it. I would love to hear the panelists' opinions on the potential impact of AI tools like ChatGPT or Bard on the propagation of religious messages. And the question goes on to point out, typically human subjectivity has played quite a large role there across various traditions. And so the question is, can AI provide a more comprehensive and objective perspective, reducing human subjectivity when propagating religious texts? And what are the potential negative consequences of using AI in this context? And on the flip side, what might the positive outcomes be? I think this is an area where several of you have done some work. So any thoughts on this question?
I'll kick that one off. I mean, first of all, it's actually a great question. I do think there is a possibility for some, hopefully, because you know how when we talk about religious traditions, we talk about the ideal that is the tradition itself and its kind and its form versus how it plays out in the world. And because, and this is, I guess, the benefit and the detriment, because we're dealing with AI that is not immersed in the world, there may be a certain type of there may be a better articulation of it or a better playing at it, but that also is the danger too. What happens when religious messages become totally theoretical and are not connected to the world simply because they're being generated by something that is not necessarily that is in the world, but is not in the world in the ways that the origins of the messages are.
My first thought was that there's something about the process of having a data set, recognizing patterns, and then generative sort of output that really favors the Catholic tradition in terms of like, could I just put all of the, I mean, they're like talking about pattern recognition, right? So like every encyclical has this like, every papal doc, it's like, it starts with everything that came before it. Like this would be brilliant. But then then it would privilege though, like if there's a pope that wrote a lot of encyclicals, then that would sort of overwhelm the data set, right? But then it betrays, I think, if I'm thinking about in terms of like putting things in, right? What am I putting into the data set for it to then recognize patterns? In terms of the study of religion, that's then again privileging doctrine, ideas, things that have been written, and ignoring so much of what religion actually is, which is in terms of like sort of popular piety, materiality, ritual, embodiment, things that, we've just started to really like take seriously in the study of religion. If we sort of think about things in terms of what I can boil down and put into the system, we're not going to be able to, I don't think, capture a lot of those things that I think are really important. Like, how do you put a Seder, except for like explaining a Seder, how do you put the actual like ritual of a Seder meal into the data set? I don't think that's possible. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah, this question of, and once again, we're back to the whole question, the perpetual question of what do we mean when we say religion? But I think here focus particularly in terms of what are the modes within our definitions of religion that privilege certain kinds of data configurations, certain kinds of confluences of practices, and really can't take account of others. It really, as we come to the end of our time today, I really am struck by the ways in which, again, what begins as a question about technology very quickly, as I think we all have pointed out, very quickly turns into, on the one hand, very existential questions of meaning, questions of what makes us human, but then also very direct and gritty kinds of material questions around what is education for? I think I especially appreciate the point about the ways in which this is forcing all of us to think through what are the ways in which the, let's say, the so-called demands of the workplace in any given instance, what are the ways in which those are moved back into our thinking in such a way that they may have a kind of shaping effect that we may or may not be comfortable with at any given time. I think this is a classic instance of something where we can't really talk about, even at the conceptual level, much less the practical level, we can't talk about impact unless we're able to move back and forth between conceptual questions of meaning and pretty direct questions of social impact. I believe we are just about at the end of our time, and as anticipated by me, it's been a really rich conversation. I just want to thank all three of our panelists, John, Catherine, Crystal. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this conversation, and obviously there's much more to come. Please note, for those of you that are watching, there is a link now, I believe, available in the chat where you can complete a very short survey about this experience. We'd love to hear from you and to hear feedback that will help us shape future religion and conversations. And we ask that next month you be on the lookout for our next religion and episode, which will be devoted to religion and hip hop. And finally, the recording of this webinar will be made available within the next week or so on the Religion and American Culture YouTube page. And we hope that that gives you a chance not only to go back over the conversation, but if any of this is helpful for your own teaching or research purposes, know that that's deeply welcome. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.